Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome. My name is Harjeev Singh. I'm the founder of Sylvan Media Ventures and publisher of the magazine BrainGain Mag, which is right behind us. We do this every year. Some of us have been here 4 years in a row, Zafina, and more. Actually, the conversation between what all of you share is the most important part about what we discuss here today. And I think we're talking about the importance of failure in learning. And it's something which is overlooked a lot of times, particularly in education. In a country which prizes 100% over any experiential learning more than anything else, I think it's a topic worth discussing, and it's a topic that's going to probably, hopefully, change how we look at how we encourage children to go into the future. And I think that's a very important thing. In India, failure is viewed as, oh my God, it's the end of the world. I mean, for a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old, I mean, that's like the worst thing you could do to them. So I'll let you lead there.
So what we were talking about earlier, and I think that feeds into this conversation about 21st century skills and the awareness that we do not know the jobs we're preparing our students for. And in that time and era, this notion of failure deprived students that we continue to chill out of our classrooms, where there's this notion that it is forbidden to fail, and thereby on paper what that translates to is if you get a 90% or if you get an 80%, you are doing well. And while we are creating, developing our students for jobs that don't exist, that theory will not sustain, because it is the need of the hour where we invest in pedagogies or invest in the kind of tools that is required to train ourselves as educators and students that failing is not a deprived feature that we want to take out or we want to take out of the learning process. Rather, it's the feature. And that every mistake that you make becomes a learning opportunity, because going forward, we need to put our bets on skills such as design thinking and ability to innovate. And ingenuity cannot happen unless you invest in design, where thereby making failure an imperative process that we need to go through.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. Yes. You have a very pertinent point. I think failure needs to be treated as a stepping stone to a learning experience. You don't necessarily need to look at it as end of the road. It's supposed to be a stepping stone to a better experience, a learning experience. But it also requires a drastic change in the mindsets, not just of the students, particularly the teaching community and the parents. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of us rely on the opinion of the teachers, the attitude of the teachers. So I think there is this great need to make this attitudinal change happen. Yeah. So everybody needs to speak about it in the classrooms. There has to be, the entire mindset needs to be transformed so that we can accept failure. At the moment, I think most of us are in a denial mode. Most of us are not able to accept failure as part of a learning experience. Right. So there is this great need for a change.
That's the irony of, I suppose, being humans, because we're, without question, imperfect, but somewhere along the way we got it in our heads that we were supposed to not ever make a mistake. And you're absolutely right, not only in the minds of the teachers and the pedagogical perspectives, but also in terms of the culture at large, do we need to kind of reconfigure the way we look at it. And that starts very much in the home. And so parents who expect perfection are probably looking for trouble. And we were having a conversation just yesterday evening discussing the notion of not ever letting a child's feet touch the ground, so to speak, and not ever giving them the option to make a mistake or fall down or skin their knee, because you expect perfection from day one and you want them to go to Harvard, you want them to go to Yale, and that's fine and that's great. But what if Harvard or Yale doesn't have the degree that they want? What then? So it's really this it's an overarching paradigm mental shift in terms of how we look at it, and understanding that yes, we are human, yes, we make mistakes, and that's okay.
I was going to say, part of this issue is we equate failure, all failure is the same. Mm-hmm. And I think that may be partly cultural, but it also might be linguistic. we don't really have a language of what I might call the fractals of failure, if I can coin that word, because certain kinds of failures, in fact, shouldn't happen, and certain kinds should. And I worked a few years ago with NASA at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech, and the job there was really to try to turn people's minds about what success and failure was around, because in fact, NASA fails 2 times out of 3.
Yeah.
2 times out of every 3 that they send something up there, it doesn't get to where it is supposed to, or it lands too hard and crashes. And so their success rate is only 1 out of 3. Well, if you look at 1 out of 3 and apply that to any sport, you'll find any sports star does about 1 out of 3.
Absolutely.
They'll strike out, they'll miss, or whatever it would be. And you don't think of people like Vikram, right, as a failure because 2 times when he's up, he doesn't do what he's supposed to, and 1/3 of the time he does. It's the 1/3 you pay attention to. But if he doesn't show up at practice every day and do what he's supposed to do, that's a failure. And it's a different kind of failure. So I'd like to introduce the idea of, can we create levels of failure or fractals of failure that say that kind of failure is a learning experience, and this kind is something you shouldn't let happen.
I guess, the idea that we should create fractals is very interesting, but can we sort of jettison the words failure and success themselves from the vocabulary? That binary is now no longer valid, and it's very difficult in a situation where students are learning much faster and much more things than the teachers. So we have a challenge in the classrooms where the teacher comes from the textbook and the student is coming from completely different space. And we have ennui, we have boredom, we have disgust, all this because we institutionally are worried about the fish that cannot climb a tree and fail to notice the fish that can fly. So I guess, we need to have a very different outlook. As I said, fractals is, sort of one way, but if you can get this word out, I used to work in the Heritage School years back, the Heritage Experiential School, which now it calls itself, and this experiential learning, I think it's one way to liberate ourselves, and we have schools which come up with some interesting, depictions of themselves. I come from also the Presidium schools where they say, be what you want to be. Whether they are able to do that or not is a different question. But I think, when you invite the students to be what they want to be, I think you're taken one step forward. I think this space creation for learning and autonomous learning, not directed learning, I think that is one step which you can add, and I will repeat. In the Krishnamurti schools, for instance, we play with structure and we play with philosophy. And the combination of both, the structure in the sense, all Krishnamurti schools are one-section schools. They're usually 300 to 350 students, if not less. I know a Krishnamurti school which is 75 students, and it is having nursery to grade 12. So you'll be sort of, looking at how is that possible, and whether it is commercially possible, whether it is academically sensible, etc., etc. But all those are time-tested ways of exploring this thing and allowing the fish to fly as well as the fish to climb a tree, or just be a swimmer. Not a problem.
Can I just add a point? Yes. So I think what is failure? I think that's the big question. I think failure is very relative. So when I have a child in college and I have one 12th grader at home, right, to attempt birds this year. So I think the whole concept of failure and how we classify them is very relative, right? So for example, in a classroom, I know my daughter who's struggling to be up there says, the teacher comes to the class and says, you are a 90% or you are a 100%, you are an SRCC, you are a, XYZ college. And that's really demeaning. So I think we're categorizing their students and then identifying them and putting them in brackets and stratifying, stratifying the whole students, because we are addressing students here. We're stratifying the students and categorizing them into failures and successes in different grades.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the whole definition of failure has to change in the first place. As he says, there's no gradient here. So
the famous quote by Dr. AJP Abdul Kalam is, of course, that fail means the first attempt in learning, and I really like that. Experiential education for me is out of the classroom education is really important. I've really championed camps for our students. They go away for 4 days, no screens, no phones, and it's 4 days of teenagers interacting, having real conversations, playing games, and being creative without any technology. I think that's really important to do. Last week we had our Year 10s out on CSR projects around different places in Delhi. I was at the Nirmal school yesterday, and our students basically put in a library for the school. They came up with a cataloguing system, and the Angelique Foundation donated all the books, but our kids came up with a way of recording everything. They laid a carpet, so they figured out about underlay and how to actually glue it down, something they would have never have done in a classroom situation. And just brilliant, interacting with kids, having the kids from the school putting their handprints on the wall. They came up with all this creativity themselves. So I think putting kids in situations where they can be creative and innovative is something that we have to develop. I know it's a bit of a struggle, perhaps in CBSE schools, but this is something that has to come forward. So creativity, innovation, I think are the absolute keys.
Yes, I would pick on what Zafina said. How many times are we trying to teach our kids the definition of what is success and what is failure? We do not really tell them what it is, and it differs from people to people, student to student. So if at all the success is seen as you being competitive, that's not true. I'll give you an example from NYU Abu Dhabi. That's a university that admits like leaders and the toppers and the best of the students. So I was sitting with one of my students and he's admitted there, and we were just chatting, and he said, you know what? This university has taught me so much. I said, how? I mean, you have been one of the best students in the country and you are in one of the best universities. So he's like, this university taught me how to fail. I said, really? I got a B grade first time ever in my life in this university. I'm like, but you didn't fail. You just got a B grade, which doesn't mean that you failed. No, I always got A pluses in my life, and this is the first time. So I learned how to fail. So, how you see failure and success is very different. And I think there has to be a clear demarcation, especially when you're talking to kids and telling them that it's okay not to do well. It's okay if you're not the topper. It's okay if you're not the first one in the class. As long as you are comfortable, you tried and you did your best, I think that's about it. And things that you want will fall onto your lap one day, if you're really passionate about it. So it's all about, the success and the competition and, the grades that we talk about and how good you are, how competitive you are. But it has to change somewhere, The schools are always like, oh, you are 100%, you're 90%, and what you're saying is like, you'll go to this university, you'll go to that university. There's life beyond. And tell me one successful person who has never failed.
See, we need to have a paradigm shift in not only in especially what he was mentioning, particularly the CBSE schools. The IB, IGSE schools are moving way ahead in that manner, but in the CBSE schools, we need to have a paradigm shift in the course curriculum. Add on more of biographical stories of the leaders who have been failures, not failures exactly. They have learned from having failed. And we also need to work on the teachers' trainings, because our training modules need to come up in that manner, wherein ultimately the teacher is the one who's guiding. And moreover, a teacher looks into the paper, if we talk of English language in particular, the English teachers, rule by rule if it is not done, and the child faces the brunt. So we need to work on that. That's the core thing. So I think the teachers' trainings here make a lot of difference, because that is how we'll be able to shape out our children, because their acceptability has to come that it is not a failure.
Right.
Well, what I was thinking about was that it's a challenge for everyone, because absolutely the teachers need to be on board. But when we think about assessment, right, so how is assessment done in most schools? Well, if it's an exam at the end of high school that you must get an X grade on, the teachers are compelled to teach in such a way that leads students to that exam and that result. And so there are many areas. Yes, it needs to start at home. Parents need to accept failure. Teachers need to change. But, at many levels, things need to change, because if you're offering, if assessment doesn't look like an exam at the end of 12 years, but it looks more like an ongoing process where there are smaller projects and ways for students to be assessed in an ongoing way to see, well, I've learned this so far. Here's what I've learned so far, and how can I take this to move? And assessment is a huge piece of making experiential learning sort of quantifiable, because in the end, we all have to have a way to accept a student to a university. A GPA still matters, whether we think other things matter as well. So it's about finding ways, I think, to look at assessment differently as well. If we start from sort of that top down and say, like, okay, when someone leaves high school, they need to have achieved these things, and how do we measure that? Because I think when we still have a culture, and not just in India, but in lots of places where we measure things by a very concrete score, we don't appreciate the process that it took to get there. Right. And so I think assessment is also a big thing to talk about when we talk about failure and success.
So I'm going to try and join 2 points right here. One is on the PD and the other is on the assessment, right? Coming from an experiential school that is CBSE mandated, investing in quality PD becomes key, but modeling what it looks like in a classroom to have failures happening around you and students learning from there involves you moving the power of instruction from the teachers to students. And having done that, I can guarantee it's an anxious panic attack that teachers go through when you throw out something like design challenges, which we found that to be compelling, where we say you're in a biology classroom, here is 5 hours, create a product that enhances wellness in your parents. You have all the freedom to do that. So what happens in a PD model, where we are in classroom and teachers are just watching us experiment here, is students go online, they figure out projects, they're working on it, and now the teacher is unable to guide them because they are not in the same level of knowledge as students are. So signaling to them that it's okay. It's okay that the students are in control and they know more than you, and that is not a sign of knowledge gap among the teachers. So modeling that and driving that point becomes a very strong imperative if you want to push something like failure as a learning movement in the classroom. And we've also figured out assessment to be a key part. We realized that the end of the school year assessment that we do is not enough, because that's what puts the pressure on whether you passed or failed. Then what could be an alternative? We figured assessment for learning, right? As you mentioned, monitoring check-ins, but this time not done by teachers, done for teachers by the students. So something called self-regulated assessments, where the teacher is now collecting feedback from the students on, did this instructional methodology work? Did it reach that knowledge target that I'm trying to, before you put them in the end of assessment and figure out whether you're 90% or 80%.
The conversation has few thoughts, certainly. So coming in a way from a place where I'm consumer of what you produce, the good students, and then we take them forward. The few things that just came across in the conversation, particularly the idea of failure and the idea that the binaries, I think a couple of people did bring it up. I think it expands further, that the word failure to some is a metric, to others is a value, yet to others it's a rite of passage. And it eventually distills down to what you were saying a minute ago about challenge and eventually assessment. And that is something, to be quite, let's say, direct, what we're finding is the peak of education, design, experiential learning, and all that stuff, it's good. It's conversation. But what we're seeing is that globally, but particularly coming from an American style system, the creativity is kind of displacing actual competence, and it's become a real issue, because because again, these are words, semantics. We have to be careful about that. And the idea of how we see, I'm an experimental physicist, yeah. So failure and what not failure, and you said something about NASA a minute ago. It's not 1 and 2, it's a lot more than that. You do thousands of experiments before you get to anywhere near a thing that you will try to even send up, yeah? Right. So this chain is much longer in that sense. So it's about how in education we look at not going beyond boundaries, which mean binaries, sorry, I meant to say, which means that answers, not answer, solutions, not solution. And that instantly allows you to expand that idea of there is no idea of failure. It's a set of solutions you'll find. This leads to a final point I want to make at this stage, is that what we're seeing is among the students that idea of setting up a problem, meaning talking about it, identifying it. That part is growing because of emphasis on how they learn, how they experience, but being able to actually solve problems is decreasing heavily. It's actually plummeting. Yeah? So you can see, again, numbers, that why do Western graduate schools or higher level learning institutions need very often to import a large amount of their intake, and also industry in the developed world needs to import from so-called rote learning traditions. The answer is that we're not looking at what is the value that resides, intrinsic value, in so-called easily dismissed rote learning at the expense of a bigger management speak of learning, right? So we need to look at what are the details and what's actually producing. Yeah? And we are finding that every year, I think Shailaja can chip in also, that the students who come into Cambridge, who we interview, their skills are becoming more and more talking about the problems rather than being able to solve them across the world, but particularly from a specific, let's say, a Western system. While the Chinese and Indians and Russians and Kazakhs are still performing much better than Eastern Europeans in being able to actually target it, because they have the library of information which is dismissed now as rote. So we have to think about that carefully.
Bennett?
Yeah, I'm kind of reacting to that and saying around the world, because I don't find that around the world. Maybe true in Cambridge. But I think that what you're also seeing is this idea of, you've almost presented another binary. It's either rote or it's creative. And I do think there are gradients here, and I think that they're very real, particularly in higher education. I don't know anything about high school, never taught high school, never taught anything less than freshman, and usually I teach graduate level. So I may have a skewed view, but the idea that says there are times, in fact this is my point, that rote learning is absolutely essential, and you have to do it at a very high level. And there are times that the creative is essential, and you have to do that at a very high level. But inherently, more of what you try in the creative will fail than when you do in the rote. So there's a difference there in just the nature of the problem solving.
I don't think so. I think they both have equal degree of failure and success. Rote doesn't mean that since it's there, you'll be able to regurgitate it.
It doesn't mean you'll be able to regurgitate it. What I'm suggesting, though, is there are more what we might call absolute standards of success. And many of the program tests, the admissions tests, really are testing that. Do you have an absolute competence in this kind of rote learning? And if you do, then you get the high scores on the GREs or whatever the test is.
So I'll come back to that again, the round circle is the academic assessment. So we are doing academic assessments, and there are certain, I think these academic assessments are so important because they determine college outcomes. Period. How you do well in school, ultimately, you know where you're going to land up in college. And what the college wants is very different from what the schools are testing. So there is a gap there,
There's a gap.
which the students try to, in the Indian scenario, trust me, I'm going through this every day, where the bridge from school to college is not being covered in schools.
Sure.
So there is academic assessment, there's something what colleges want, and that bridge is covered by coaching center which play in the middle role somewhere, testing logic and your problem solving skill sets, etc. So why aren't we addressing the issue of academic assessments and what we are assessing in schools, and then provide what colleges are looking for in students, rather than guessing it and trying to change.
I just wanted to add to that. So as someone who sits and reads applications every year for students, as one of the fellows at my college and previously as admissions tutor, the point you're raising about the gap between school and college goes beyond the assessment system. It goes to, I think, the point that the lady made there about what is it that you're thinking about your schools and what do you expect kids to get from the exam system. And I'd like to make 3 points in relation to this. The first is schools teach often to the exam, and they need to do that because that's one of the criteria of getting to university. But they don't seem to know what else to put in the personal statement. So here I'm talking to all of you as principals. We've seen good personal statements and bad ones, and we've seen good references and bad references. So some of the blame is to us as academia. Maybe it's just our age and how we were taught. So young people need to show their ability to do learning, whether it's rote or experiential, but to understand results. But they also need to show, as our colleague from British School said, how they think in group situations. And one of the things that we find increasingly, and I was saying to Harji, I'll bring this up, is, for example, the Duke of Edinburgh Award, which brings schools of all backgrounds together. So you've got top schools and kids from state schools. I've been a governor at state school for 10 years in the UK, so it's a government school system. And it brings them together in the same place. It's bronze, and many of you might have done the bronze. Some of you might have had the audacity to go up to the gold level. But you're given an ordnance map and you're told walk. And you get lost. And the whole purpose of that ordnance map is to get lost. And the more lost you get, the more your mates make fun of you, but it's a bonding experience. But it's for the first time for a lot of them that getting lost is a bonding experience. And so it's something that you think about. So when a kid says, I've done Duke of Edinburgh, I look at that and say, what happened in your experience? I'm not interested. I know you've got, A stars, or you wouldn't be here for the interview, but what's your bonding experience? So the second thing is creating things of that sort, whether they're design or film, but where they can learn in the group. So that's the second thing that we like to see in the statement. And the third is what they read. And what I am most despondent about is they say, we don't have time to read. And so you say to them, what have you done beyond your text? Oh, I thought of reading that book, and they'll put it on their statement. But by the time they get to the interview, they haven't had time to read it. And I'm going, and the reason we need them to read is because that's what the future is about. Everything that they've learned when they've come to college, we take as given. And then you're pushing them another whole level. And that's not whether they're Cambridge or Oxford, it's what the world out there is going to teach them. So the 3 things I want to see in a personal statement. I'll talk more about it later when the students are there. But that I thought would be worth listening to.
So I was just getting back to the point that we were talking about. The paradigm shift that is expected is from the system. The system, it's basically systemic. If the system doesn't support, then the whole thing collapses. All of us are progressive thinkers. All of us are doing in our own ways in the formative years, all kinds of group activities, all kinds of experiential learning. But at the end, it is the assessment, like you mentioned. So when it comes to assessment, we need to orient our parents. Like yesterday, I was sitting for almost 4 hours with a set of just 7 parents of 7 students, just trying to tell them that this is not the end of the world. They haven't been able to clear their pre-board exams. And they were ready to collapse, They thought that's the end and the board exams are just round the corner. They cannot handle it. And what is going to become of this child? So it's the parents that need that orientation and that regular, so it has to be right from the beginning. So systemic in that sense, and CBSE. All right, systemic in the form of curriculum and assessments that we have. So I think the shift is required completely over there.
And I'd like to add a point to what you just said, that not only we can coach and engage with students, we can also orient parents, we can train teachers, but there is a bigger perspective, society. I mean, parents these days are more concerned about the naysayers. I mean, what would the others say about what's going on in our lives? So more important for them is not making their child learn the failures or facing the failures, but more important is how would others feel and think about my child. It becomes a prestige issue for most of them. So that has to be dealt appropriately, because failure will always be inevitable, but then it will definitely add experience, value, as well as learning to the child as well as the parents. They can actually take a leap and go at a faster pace towards the success. But the way the paradigm shift can only happen if we have the awareness amongst the entire society, not only the parents, teachers, as well as the students.
Whereas parents make up the society.
Yes, exactly. Andrew, you had something. I'll come to Bennett right after.
There were two things that I was thinking about. One was in relation to what Christina said about assessments. We talk about child assessments, but I was reading a book by Stephen Brookfield about becoming a critically reflective teacher, and nobody ever really thinks about professorial assessments as well. And the thing is, there's a great deal of ego, I feel, involved in being a teacher, and it takes a very strong person to admit that they don't know as much as their students know, and to present that as okay. So that's point number one. So when we talk about assessments, yes, we talk about student assessments, but at the end of the year, a teacher's being assessed on what? If their students pass the test. And so there's a great deal of stress, I feel, involved in that, and if they feel like that's their metric, then they're going to be teaching to the test. Part two is, I don't know, I can only speak for myself, but if I were judged on my ability to pass a standard test alone, as opposed to being able to talk about what I know, I'd be in a very different boat. So I think that we need to rethink, again, how we look at defining knowledge and defining learning. And yes, there's room for rote learning, but there must be room for the ability to dialogue. And that's something I learned from Basilio. Basilio is a professor of international communication at St. John's University. And he's a great man because he believes in forgetting the standardized test. He believes in writing and talking about what you learn, having a conversation which can display as much, if not more, knowledge to be able to connect the dots than just filling out a standard test, because you can study for that exam, but you can't really fake knowledge when it comes to really being versed in a topic if you're discussing it. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I'm picking up on the assessment idea because I think when you're transitioning from the high school to a collegiate or a higher university, clearly you need the assessment as a gate. I think everybody agrees with that. What the university is doing, and this is being involved in 3-year development programs for curriculum, if you don't get that idea that accomplishment is also important, which isn't necessarily accessible in a quantitative way, if you don't get that, we spend a great deal of time in the first year of our curriculum at college teaching that. Group work, for example, results, showing up and doing the assignment as opposed to getting the answer. I'll pick up their answers. Tell me 1, tell me 2, tell me 3, tell me 4, tell me 5, keep going. How do you get that transition? And maybe the first year of university is the appropriate place. Maybe it's not, I don't know. I mean, that's something that each group here will have to decide. But towards getting to an accomplishment model as well, what did you accomplish? Some of it can be quantifiable, some of it is, what is good art? Can anyone define that? Artists can't define that. They keep creating and somebody says, oh, that's good. Somebody says, that's terrific. What's a good movie? Well, one that makes money? Well, certainly that would be one criterion, but it isn't the criterion that we would probably use. Oh, it made a lot of money, it must be good, right? Well, no. Did it affect you emotionally?
Right.
Does it have a story that's interesting? Are the characters compelling? I think that there's a need there to try to bridge, I don't know why I'm doing all this alliteration today, somewhere from assessment to accomplishment. How do we expand the envelope or the funnel?
Right.
It's an interesting idea because, this notion that you need to have the score or something. I mean, of course, in American high schools, we have grades and things, and we do have the SAT and the ACT, although many universities, including St. John's, have moved to SAT option. So basically, you don't have to submit an SAT score in order to be evaluated for admission to the university, because you do have your high school grades. We have personal statements. We look at what other activities did you do, were you on a team, can you work in groups, etc. Now, you could argue that perhaps we're not preparing our students very well for further thinking later on, but there are ways to acknowledge the accomplishments of students without those gatekeeper exams. Because even in the US, where we haven't had this tradition of like one formal, everyone takes it, score kills you or it doesn't, we did have the SAT as a pretty standard way to measure whether or not a student is ready. And many universities are walking away from it because what they're seeing is that actually the grades that students are getting in their high school years are a better predictor of success at the university than the SAT itself, or at least as good as, in many cases, the SAT. So it's an unnecessary burden of study and cost for the student to take this exam that isn't a very good predictor of their achievement, or potential achievement, and not necessarily representative of their accomplishments. So.
Okay, I think this assessment is a pretty loaded word, and I find in many schools, the CBSE schools particularly, the idea of assessment is conflated with the idea of evaluation, which is a lower animal. And we also want to sort of figure out a systemic, that word was also used here, a systemic approach to assessment. I think we have got into a mess trying to do this, because CBSE has now, for enforcing systems, it has got into the idea of blueprints, answer keys, marking scheme. You have the entire matrix, which is so bounded. And we try to say, all right, you know what, I assess my student. In fact, the students know, and everybody knows, that they are being evaluated, and they have to have in the question paper 8 1-markers, 3 4-markers, 1 8-marker, and they know, they have mastered if any student is interested enough, he can score very well by just understanding the matrix of how you are going to be assessed. Evaluated, if I may use the more honest term. I think we need to cut the Gordian knot, if I may use that phrase, and we got to go for the jugular. Look at assessment, because that assessment is critical. It is critical in knowing where we have reached. I'm an engineer, and I was in the first batch of the IIT Delhi. And we celebrated in December the 51st reunion of our students. And the 51st reunion is establishing some truths which we have slowly realized over these decades. And one of this, and let me share it without any sense of shame or one of this is that we did not learn much from the teachers at the IIT. We had at the IIT the very best of teachers in 1961. We had Professor Rumford, Professor Guy, Professor Cornish, Professor Langdale, and they're supposed to be the best from the world. And these guys, now looking at it from this prism of 50 years down the line, 51 years down the line, we find that, you know what, we learned our life skills through our lives. The important thing is, the idea that, we should have critical thinking, that we should have lateral thinking, that we should have problem solving, we must be on mission mode, and we must always sort of complete the loop and see whether the learning justifies the teaching. And this is an important thing, and I am very passionate about diluting the input-based approach and focusing on the outcome-based assessment, true assessment. And I find that, most schools, in fact, I stick my neck out and say 99.99% of CBSE schools are, let's say, all over the place. They at the end of the day, they are neither beast, nor fish, nor fowl. I must make this thing, and since I'm called Anna, I might as well give this wisdom. I'm 75 years old, so I think all of you guys are much younger than me. So I'm just giving it away to you guys. And just one thought. The model United Nations conference, the simulation of the United Nations, is the way to go. Is the way to go in opening up learning possibilities. You don't need teachers. I understand that 70-75% of all learning comes from peer learning. So you meet other students and you learn a lot. And the best way to do this is to let the students go and attend maybe half a dozen MUN conferences and just get out of their way in all of this. For example, now I think corporates like Google and Apple, etc., they ask questions like how do you move Mount Fuji? Or how do you let a person who is blind from birth, what is red color? How do you explain to him what is red? And these are the kinds of explorations in applying and in discovering. How do you answer these kinds of questions? And I think there is some amount of work which is done there, but I think you must do a lot more in the school space so that the students don't get bored and the students really engage in true learning.
Okay, so based on all, I just want to add points, 2 or 3 points to whatever has been conversing. It's a very interesting. The conversation has gone on a lot of dimensions. So just the thing about peer-to-peer learning, I personally, from what I keep seeing, I feel that kids today are spending too much time, which is adult supervised. Right from school, they are completely supervised. Even recess time is supervised. What they're eating, how they're playing is supervised. When they come back home, they're not coming back on their cycles. The cities won't allow that anymore. They're again still in adult supervision. They reach their tuitions. They are still in adult supervision. They go to play. No one is just playing. You have to be coached. So again, you are in adult supervision. I mean, there is no time. I wish thankfully I didn't grow up like that. A lot of my time was not supervised by the adults and by my parents or any adults, and I think that part of where I can do things, I can experiment without them finding out, so that I can try and it's okay. It's like my friends know about it and it's cool. That time is reducing, and I think that is also adding a lot of pressure on the child to always be and act in a certain way, otherwise be reprimanded for it. That is one. Second point is that there is a spiritual leader who said a statement that the reason why we don't allow our kids to be independent is that we are afraid that they will realize they can do well without us. That's our fear, that they will understand that, and a lot of things are coming out of that fear, that my child can do things without me or without the system, and that is probably a learning for the system, for the society. A third point is that I feel is that the entire current education system, as it is a homogenized system around the world, which never was like this, is probably happened during the industrial age, because you needed a certain kind of educated people or learned a certain kind of learning to feed people into the factories or the industries. That age changed, the way the economy structure has completely changed, the structure of the world has changed, but education is still sort of trying to fit the new world into the industrial age education system, which is creating a lot of these challenges, because there is the talk of directionless between schooling and higher education and the careers finally is also because each one is stuck in some different era and preparing students for some different era and not realizing that this is seamless. There does not really need to be this kind of a distinguishment between these areas, and students have to flow from one to another. And because of this, what is also happening, I feel at times, is that one major challenge, as she mentioned, is not being able to meet students where they are. So when we are assessing them or evaluating them, we are evaluating them where they are and then leaving them there and saying, okay, you didn't do well on this subject, but how do I ensure that you do well on that subject is something that is not really the major focus of the system, and people are not being graded on that. So examinations are just to know how well the subject went down to the student, how well the student learned, and not how good or bad the student is. So this challenge is there, and for a country like India, because we have a group here, for a country like India, where millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of students are in school, and most of them are from families that cannot afford expensive education, or education where you have like a 10-to-1 student ratio, or a 15 to, like, those are huge luxuries in India. Like, your parents did extremely well to afford you an education where you have a 10-to-1 student ratio. I mean, in India, we need methods where you can teach with a 400-to-1 student ratio. You can teach with an 800-to-1 student ratio. Or what is happening is, there is a certain set of students whose parents are able to afford a certain kind of education, and this is increasing the inequality in the country. So the very system that was designed to destruct inequality is in fact creating inequality in a society like India, where millions of students are not getting the quality education, or not getting the kind of attention, because these methods are probably being discussed and created by a certain set of schools or a certain set of people who are not leading to this, not addressing this audience. So can we come up with systems where the ratio of teacher to student is 1,000:1, and yet the learning is not being affected? If this does not happen, then a country like India will only see inequality increase and a lot of civil factions that are being created, and education system is sort of a part of what is being the societal challenges that are being created right now. So I would just like to put this point open, that let us also think of how mass education will happen without diluting the quality of education, learning, and how do we assess these things, how do we evaluate students like this, and how do we ensure that everyone gets a similar opportunity to get similar kind of education and not just education.
I'd like to speak more from a parent's perspective, because that's the only thing I feel qualified to do right now. And as you said, a child is not left unsupervised at any time because of the kind of anxiety that we are going through dealing with our lives. I think the only time a child is left unsupervised is when they are online. And that is the one part of their identity or escapism that they are building into their personality. If you look at the children today, I have an 11-year-old, and I am amazed at the amount of time that he wants to spend online and not interacting with his sister or his friends or anybody else around him. It's primarily because that identity gives him a sense of independence. He knows that I cannot teach him what he wants to learn. And I feel I'm amongst the slightly more evolved parents, but who knows what's going on online as well. But when it comes to, for example, he does art, which is like much more, I mean, I don't draw at all. I know nothing about art. So what can I do besides encourage him and get him some kind of interaction with people who are artists or an art teacher or XYZ? He goes online and picks up these tutorials about art, which are much more advanced, and does them in a much less time than what I could or an art teacher could help him do. And the amount of time he spends doing art, I feel that's another form of escapism. That is away from his identity as a student, it's away from his identity as my child. So I think kids are evolving. It's just that we fail to recognize how fast they're evolving into not needing us. And when you're talking about systems for mass deployment of education, I feel technology is the way to go, because what else is this? This is mass deployment of a certain kind of education that actually interests the child and is not led by the institution per se. So they're developing their own subjects, they're learning for themselves, and they're recognizing that this learning is iterated. So it has to be collaborated, it has to be shared with their peers, and that's perhaps the next trick, the next know-how of how to get to the point.
Just wanted to just say something that online and technology-based learning in this way is not unsupervised. This is still heavily supervised and supervised by adults. We don't see them, we have to keep that in mind. It's a different paradigm of supervision.
So one thing, I'll make 2 points very quickly. So about technology, right, and the freedom for a student to be who he wants to be because the adults don't know what's going on. That is proven as educators when we look at technology and do not know where to invest. Do we invest in technology that makes our classrooms prettier with smart boards, or do we use a rule of thumb where we can draw a distinction between what technology enables my child as an informed consumer versus an informed creator? So you look at open source hardware such as Arduino and microcontroller and programming, and as I say these words, all educators, heart rates, I don't know anything about programming and I don't want to invest in that. Unfortunately, that is where we need to be going rather than putting empty screens or YouTube channels in front of our children and say, this is how you consume versus this is how you create. So that's a rule of thumb one needs to even exercise. We're talking about mass employment of students and how do you put technologies in the classroom. The other thing I wanted to bring to light is, so the conversation here in which some of the ladies brought out is, and a frustration I always run into when I go into these panel discussions is it's beautiful to hear the theory, right? We know what we want to do as progressive leaders. We want to bring in innovation, we want to bring in smaller numbers of teachers, student ratio, but rolls back to CBSE assessment, how do we go about it, considering that there are certain expectations we need to meet by the board or by the parents or the society. And the answer, I believe, is defy as educators. We need to take or put the stake in the ground and say that there is a certain criteria that our students are assessed on, there are certain standards set by society, but as educators, we need to be revolutionary in the ideas we implement in the classroom. A pattern I noticed here is CBSE is a board of examination versus a board of standards. And that is what mandates instruction or guides instructions within classrooms in India, which is ironical because as educators, we are telling a board, an examination board, will guide how I teach my students, and that needs to change. CBSE becomes a pain in senior program beyond 8, but in your middle program, you have a lot of leeway to experiment because those CBSE isn't evaluating there. And those are the areas, even in junior program, that is your kindergarten to grade 3, is where you need to highlight or find out those foot in the door windows to defy what is set by an examination board, to experiment with ideas, and again, bringing the topic back to failures, educators be open to fail and learn from there.
I just wanted to pick up on the point of unsupervised time. One of the challenges that we see, this is something that is really hard for us when I work with international students all the time exclusively, and often English language learners. And so they come to us and they're already, facing a lot of challenges because they're in a new environment, their language skills are not developed, so just the ability to function every day is difficult. But they come to us with almost no life skills. Right. They don't know how to do their own laundry. They don't know where to go to buy something. They can't make themselves a basic meal. And yes, we have a cafeteria on campus, but no one does their laundry, and no one cleans their room, and no one wakes them up in the morning. And these very basic sort of tenets of basic independence, because clearly there are different values on independence in different cultures, and even in the United States now we see a phenomenon we call helicopter parents, yes, where independence is sort of being slowly clawed back. Because I think there in the world is a perception of danger that, if you read Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, you'll know that we're actually in a much safer time than ever in our history, but we perceive danger in a different way. And so we really do our children a disservice. We want them to be successful, whatever that means. We might send our students abroad because we think that will make them successful, but we have to prepare them for the very basic act of being an adult. Of being an independent human being, of being self-sufficient. And by not allowing some of that to go back to the topic of failure, as kids, I was just talking about this yesterday with someone here about how, given a little freedom, you make very bad choices, right? Your brain is literally not capable. We know this, right? Your frontal cortex has not developed. So you make stupid decisions as a young person because that's what you do. And then you learn, oops, I won't do that again. Thank God my mother doesn't know because I will be dead. But, I survived this time and I won't do it again. So I think that ability to allow our children a little bit of leeway to fail, to make mistakes, really helps them develop as independent adults. And if we don't do that, it makes it so much harder for them to be successful. Absolutely. Because if you can't, the Maslow hierarchy, if they can't take care of their own basic needs, if they're not fed and clothed and warm and safe, because you haven't given them those tools, then they can't self-actualize. They can't ever be the successful Harvard grad because they're too busy worrying about where am I going to get dinner. Yeah. And so I think in this conversation, it's really important to talk about that ability to give our children a little bit of time to fly or swim or climb a tree, to figure out those things and to give them those basic kind of adult skills as well, because without that they can't function.
So I think Christina nailed it perfectly. So that's exactly what I was going to talk about in terms of value education and value of education. I think both needs to be inculcated, because I remember as a child we had model education at schools. It was a very Christian missionary school thing, but teaching how to respect yourself, respect others, self-esteem, and the ability to look at yourself in the mirror every day and say, yes, you're on the right track. I mean, that confidence that comes through. So value education is extremely important, just not namesake value education, which a lot of schools do put up as, very good mottos, and what do you call those? They have these very nice sayings, of these poets and quotes and stuff like that up on their school boards. But then how many students are reading them, and how are you explaining this to the student? I think that's extremely important. I think recently I read a news about the happiness class that's going to be incorporated in schools. That's a great start. I think that's where students will learn about how to respect themselves and self-esteem and accept failures, or not actually, I wouldn't, certain situations in life, rather than just stating that as failures. The word failure itself should not be viewed as negative. I think it's time to move on to think as positive. So
I just want to add to what Christine was saying in relation to flipping fear to anxiety. I think we have a very, very anxious generation of adults. We are anxious about our futures. I'm anxious about my pension scheme. When I go back, there'll be one. Things ain't happening. So these are the things that we need to think about, and responses to anxiety do not promote the idea of choice. I like to put it in two contexts. One is a lot of people are caning the CBSE. I did the CBSE. I survived. We will survive. Okay, the CBSE is a bad system, but only a bad system because, as you said, you think about that as the entire life of a child is that exam. And the same thing with the GCSE in England. I'm sure it's the same thing with SATs if you're doing it. Gaokao is worse. I'm not even good. It's up there. I work on China, so I'm totally there with you. But the middle years, the adolescent years, where young people are trying to make choices, where with hormones and anxieties kick in anyway, I think it's in that space. And I'm also realizing, more and more, and I take your point, Falguni, very seriously, that for a lot of young people in India, class 10 is probably the last time they're going to make a choice, because after that, their 10th result determines art, science, commerce. It's still that word, I'm sure, 30 years on. And so, the choices diminish by the time you enter class 9 or 10. So if you start thinking about young people, and if we start thinking about digital, we were talking about it yesterday, of course, many of the jobs they're going to do are not going to be related to the stuff they do in class 10. So this idea that we all have that what happens when they're 16, that exam is going to determine what they do from the time they're 10 years old, is something we need to recreate, another space where they can deal with anxiety at an earlier time. So the first time they're anxious is not that 10th board, particularly in Delhi, I know, where you don't do exams till class 10, and then all the terrible suicide rates you had around the results of the board. Let me take it the other way. The consequence of anxiety is so high in international systems of education university, even Cambridge, and we're very late in doing stuff, have mindfulness classes which are provided for free as a public service to reduce anxiety, fortunately not always suicide, but serious mental illness among students, simply with the idea that they're not going to be good enough. And so I want to flip it both ways, and maybe one of the things that we can talk about is failure in learning, but just failure to learn about failure itself is something that it's the anxiety that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, quickly, I must salute my senior here. I'm 2 years younger to him from IIT. I'm into the use of technology for future, particularly in education. And I can see what you were addressing, that we would be able to address the other 85% only if we think of a system which is not dependent upon teachers, but can be helped by technology. And besides teaching, we are now moving into an area where assessments can be done while he is learning on a complete profiling basis. If I was to project 3 years down the line, we could have this room with the ultra haptics, which is monitoring exactly what we are doing and saying who contributed what and what was his reactions. So if that assessment is made into the system, and there are experiments happening right now, probably some of the very good ones in India. For instance, if you're teaching somebody to play cricket, now Sachin Tendulkar could come and teach, but how many people can he teach? But if he have a system whereby anywhere in a street in any one of the villages, somebody could be just having his mobile phone and he's playing and he's getting a feedback to say Sachin would have played it like this rather than that. So he's accepting failures, he's learning from failures, and he's being known to the rest of the world when he's getting closer to Sachin Tendulkar. These are the kind of systems which are possible, which can happen, and which will cut across some of the boundaries which we are putting in terms of the subjects. Because they would learn what they are interested in, and they would passionately see what does he mean when he's saying this angle is wrong. I don't even know anything about mathematics. Probably we need to move more in that directions, and I think things are moving in those areas.
I also often talk to university students and the colleges about one serious issue which I've been seeing for the last couple of years, and that is value system and ethics in the schools and in colleges. And I give an example, like all of us, at least who have spent their part of life and see it in the angle, I call it horse blinkers. We all need to go in the direction that, okay, we have some path, we need to move on that. Today what happens is, at a young age, the parenting is the biggest issue. You deviate from your house values, which parents don't tell them actually properly, and they deviate that. On the other side, when they get into society, schools maybe 10th, 8th, 9th, 10th and plus more, they deviate from their ethics. So example, this is at my band of working. What happens is you start telling lies at the young age of 3 years, and the father tells the guy that बोल तो घर में phone नहीं है. No, phone पर नहीं है. That starts with that. Growing a little more, the parents tell them how to tell lies about the money part of it. Little elder, you get into pleasuring is a very big issue. Copying, pleasuring, assignments, big issue coming in. And then when you grow further, you find your CV and you get some job. So one gets job, second fellow also does it. So both sides, there is a huge deviation in this. The point I'm trying to raise is that can we get into the schools at a young age to give a value system there? Very important, very, very critical. This is what I'm facing in the become adult, the serious matter in the whole country. That's what I've been seeing.
She spoke about value education and all what we studied, being part of the convent schools and all. And today also we have life skills. But then life skills is a subject. How it is being taught in schools is again a big question mark. And wherein, the basic factors that we need to, again, I get back on my point, we need to train the teachers of how they are teaching the life skills in schools. And I have been a part of elite schools like Vasant Valley, where yes, we used to do life skills, we used to incorporate it in our core curriculum also. And presently I'm a part of a group which we have pan-India 120 schools, and fortunately or unfortunately for us, only 5 or 6 of them are in metros. Rest all we are in tier 2, tier 3 cities. And there, yes, we are doing a lot of work into trainings and all, and as he pointed out, the digital learning, and we are incorporating through digitalization, we are incorporating the things and all. Challenges are there, and as she pointed out, yes, the system support is required at times, because yes, our major challenges with the system. We had very beautifully taken off 10th board exams, external board, and the schools had the leverage and we were doing it. And it took 8 to 10 years, and especially tier 2, tier 3 cities to train the teachers. And again, now we are reverting back. So politically, I may sound incorrect, but then we need to move out education out of politics. And some way the think tanks have to take over that thing, because it is required. And yes, things are tough, but then they are also not that tough. But yes, I agree with him. We need to work on the masses, and our masses are in tier 2, tier 3 cities. So that bridging of the gaps have to be there. The parents there have to be enlightened, and they need to understand technology, so that, you know, it gets incorporated further.
So I just want to add what Sir has said, that, you know, a child is there with us from class nursery till class 7th, 8th, and those are the basic years when you can actually teach them what life is all about. You know, give them a bigger perspective, more than grades, or just bring the CBSE system, how it is, how good or bad it is, or how the international or higher education or Indian higher education has been. So just teach them that it will come on your way. Problems is part of life, you know, and you're going to fail, you're going to take bad decisions, and you will learn through that. So I think we lose out the focus when we are trying to tell them everything right, and blaming the system, that we are not in a good system, right? There's something wrong with the system. There's nothing wrong. The problems will stay. You know, we never had a perfect world. We always had problem in our world. So let's teach our children that failure is a part of life. You know, teach them a bigger perspective. And I think there's enough time given in the schools from a 4-year-old till they are like, you know, 13, 14 year of age, when they get into the board system, or, you know. So it's enough time to give them those moral values, give them that what is right, what is wrong, and let them decide themselves. Give them that leeway to make mistakes, and, you know, accept failure as they accept success.
I'll just take a little bit of time here. You know, the problem here is, when you look at the advertisement in newspapers and schools come today, nobody talks about what they're teaching. It all talks about who taught, how many people taught, 99%, 80%. Can we put a stop to it? You know, because this is something that you're trying to sell as a school. You know, I'm not talking about any particular school. That here you're delivering results and you're not talking about. See, that is where the fear of failure begins with parents and students. You know, like we have doctors and advocates not supposed to advertise. I think somewhere there should be a regulation saying that schools should not advertise meritorious students or something. I mean, you can obviously mention a different way, but just putting 5 pictures of the people who talk, I think you're really hurting the remaining 1,000 students who were there in the school.
Very important point. It's a funny story that there was a parent I was talking to once and said that I met one of your graduates, like this is a previous organization that I was working with, and said I met one of your graduates in the I know the family, and since this child has graduated 6 months, is sitting at home not doing much. So you've not really made your kids ambitious or anything. This program isn't working, etc. So I just had this blank look. I said, look, I don't know why he's sitting at home, but there must be a purpose to it. But said, how do you really assess this success and failure and ambition? So it was like, you know, success is like being very ambitious. And I don't know how it came out, but you know, sometimes you're just irritated by something and you say something. So I happened to ask him, would you say Lord Buddha was not ambitious because he left the palace for the woods? You know? So I just want to leave it at that you know, success, failure and ambition and all can have so many qualities.
Good point, yeah. Thank you all, you've been fantastic. I've actually learned a lot more this morning than I usually do. And that's why I love this session the most during the entire forum. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you upstairs.